I fear not the dark itself, but what may lurk within it. Welcome to Lurk, bringing you creepy, strange, and bone-chilling stories, with your host, Jamie Jackson.
Hey Lurkers, welcome to this week's episode. This week we are continuing our topic of the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run with part 2. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, please go back and listen to that first and then come back and listen to this episode. When we left off last week, police had come up with a list of things they knew about the killer. They all believed that the killer was getting smarter with each kill, choosing his more recent victims based on their anonymity. Then, in September of 1936, when every hobo and railroad detective was in a state of heightened alarm, the killer again selected Kingsbury Run for his next victim. The killer seemed to be taking unbelievable risks to humiliate the police. After his sixth victim, Ness allocated unprecedented resources to finding the killer. Among the many patrolmen and homicide detectives working on the case, the name of Peter Merlot is most often remembered as the key police figure. Merlot, a very intelligent but eccentric policeman with the ability to speak a number of European languages, began his career as a motorcycle cop. He was a short, stocky man who had the tenacity of a pit bull. Once an idea fixed itself in Merlot's mind, he worked it through to no end. Merlot did everything within his power to get assigned to the Kingsbury Run case full-time. His persistence paid off, and he was virtually dedicated to the case for years. He and his partner, Martin Zalewski, were making a career of the Mad Butcher. Nobody on the police force doubted Merlot's zeal in tracking down every potential suspect and clue. However, his methods, which included parading up and down Kingsbury Run in his long johns in the moonlight to bait the killer, were a source of controversy. No screwball escaped Merlot's scrutiny. Of the estimated 10,000 suspects who were interrogated in the 4-year murder investigation, the weirdest ones were saved for Merlot. With his round-the-clock adventures with the city's crazies, Merlot was a popular source for the newspaper reporters. The dedicated detective never felt constrained by protocol to have his remarks reviewed in advance by the higher-ups in the police department. Consequently, Merlot's opinions were often published as though they represented the official police position, when often it was not the case. One official believed that Merlot was allowed to speculate to reporters so that his colorful stories and theories would distract the press from the lack of progress. Just as Elliot Ness was starting to feel that the police department and the city's major organized criminals were getting under control, the Mad Butcher's handiwork surfaced again on February 23, 1937. This time it was a virtual repeat of the Lady of the Lake murder back in 1934. The upper portion of victim 7 was found washed up on the beach at 156th Street, almost the same place where portions of the Lady of the Lake had been found. Like the others, she was headless. Her arms had been amputated and the torso bisected. While the torso was taken to the morgue, Detectives Merlot and Zalewski followed what looked like a trail of blood and questioned the residents in the area. As in the 1934 murder, the question remained: was she dumped in Lake Erie where she washed up on the beach, or did her body float from Kingsbury Run into the Cuyahoga River and then into the lake? More than 2 months later, the lower portion of the woman's torso was found floating off East 30th Street, much closer to the mouth of the Cuyahoga River. This was the first victim seen by the newly elected coroner, Samuel Gerber. The Kingsbury Run murders offered Gerber a special challenge intellectually, and he devoted countless hours to reviewing the details of the case. The reward was a flattering amount of newspaper attention, which, like all publicly elected officials, he began to relish. When the upper portion of the torso was found, the woman had only been dead 2 to 4 days and had been in the water not more than 3. The headless woman was between 25 and 35 years old, weighed approximately 100 to 120 pounds, had a light complexion and medium brown hair. The only other things that they knew about her were that she lived in the city, given the dirt in her lungs and moderate emphysema, and that she had been pregnant at least once. Despite a thorough investigation, this was all they would ever know of the woman who became known as Victim 7. While her legs were removed with 2 clean, sweeping strokes of a heavy knife, and the arms were removed with the murderer's usual skill, the bisection of the torso showed multiple hesitation marks. Unlike most of the other victims, death did not appear to be caused by decapitation. The blood clots in the heart indicated that the decapitation was post-mortem. The arms, legs, head, and clothing were never found, nor was her identity ever discovered. Perhaps as a joke, the killer added a new touch with this victim. He had inserted a pants pocket inside the woman's rectum. The rectum had been stretched to accommodate this foreign object. In March, Gerber produced a summary of the 7 victims. Oddly enough, 1934's Lady of the Lake was still not included in the official victim count. Like his predecessor, Arthur Pierce, Gerber was convinced that all of the murders were committed by one individual. He considered the dissection of the corpses and the missing hands and heads a means for the killer to easily transport the body and to foil identification. After all, the last victim to be identified was Victim 3, Flo Polillo. The killer was a right-handed man using a heavy, sharp knife. His knowledge of anatomy was clear. For the first time, the notion of a surgeon, medical student, male nurse, or veterinarian was emphasized, as well as a butcher or hunter. Gerber found the sex factor in the crimes difficult to evaluate and unique in the history of such crimes. The Mad Butcher appeared to be the first sexual psychopath on record at that time to murder members of both sexes. Ness appealed to the press to tone down their reporting, and the editors agreed to cooperate, beginning with Dr. Gerber's report. Gerber, a man with a huge ego, was furious with Ness for suppressing publicity. This was the beginning of a feud between the coroner's office and the safety director's office that only worsened with time. June 6, 1937, a teenager named Russell had been watching the Coast Guard boats on the Cuyahoga River. On his way home, he made a gruesome discovery about 400 feet west of Stone's Levee under the 5th span of the Lorraine-Carnegie Bridge. Lying in a rotting burlap bag, along with a newspaper from June of the previous year, was the partial skeleton of a woman who had been dead approximately 1 year. Gerber described Victim 8 as a tiny woman, no more than 5 feet tall, with small, delicate bones. Even though her arms and legs were missing, there was a skull with extensive dental work. Gerber wrote, "On examination, there is an entirely wide nasal aperture. The alveolar ridges are quite prominent with considerable prognathism. The texture of the bone here is quite fine. Due to this, the wide nasal aperture and the prominent alveolar prognathism, together with the penchant for gold crowns prominently displayed on the teeth, suggest the victim to be a Negro. In addition, there is a mass of black hair in a wig-like arrangement. This hair is kinky and curly with an occasional rusty hairpin. This type of hair suggests that it belongs to a colored female. There was considerable hacking and cutting of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th cervical vertebrae, but it was impossible to tell from the skeleton whether decapitation was the cause of death. The body had been treated with quicklime, which left very little flesh on the bones, and had eroded much of the cartilage. The skeleton had been wrapped in a piece of newspaper that carried an advertisement for a certain performance at the Palace Theater in June of 1936. Detective Orley May contacted the manager at the theater, The manager confirmed that the Nils T. Grantland girls performed a revue at the theater in June of 1936, and that they were playing in New York City at the time this victim was discovered. He did not recall any of the girls missing from the company while they were in Cleveland. The police were sent a letter referencing a long-dead dentist and proposing that the victim was a prostitute named Rose Wallace. After a lengthy investigation of Rose Wallace's life and her August 1936 disappearance, both Dr. Gerber and Sergeant Hogan rejected the identification. Detective Merlot, however, firmly believed the victim to be Rose. The Mad Butcher struck again a month after the woman's skeleton was found. On July 6, 1937, the upper portion of a man's torso, plus his 2 thighs, floated in the Cuyahoga River just below Kingsbury Run. For the next week, pieces of the victim floated downstream. Just about everything was retrieved except for the head. This man, who was never identified, was approximately 5'8" and approximately 150 pounds. He had well-groomed fingernails and was about 40 years of age. He had been dead a couple of days when the first parts of his body were found. Decapitation was the cause of death, but there was something new this time. Some of the surgery was very sloppy, and some was very skillful. For the first time, the killer had removed all of the abdominal organs and heart, none of which were ever found. Ever since Dr. Gerber had suggested that Kingsbury Run murderer could be a medic, the police began to focus on doctors. In fact, all the area physicians, medical students, and male nurses were checked out. Special surveillance was warranted for doctors that had a history of eccentricity or a weakness for illicit sex, drugs, or booze, or any suspicion of homosexual activity. One of these physicians was a Dr. Frank E. Sweeney, who seemed to fit the profile of the murderer they were seeking. He was physically very tall, large, and strong. Sweeney had grown up in the Kingsbury Run area and at various times had his office there. He had a serious problem with alcohol that caused his separation from his wife and sons and the loss of his surgical residency at St. Alexis, a hospital very close to Kingsbury Run. He was rumored to be bisexual and had a very violent temper when he drank. Eventually, in 1937, the police abandoned Dr. Sweeney as a suspect because he was frequently out of town at a veterans hospital in Sandusky when a fresh victim was discovered. Dr. Sweeney was no relation to the highly respected police officer Joseph Sweeney. The year 1937 brought with it 3 more decapitated bodies, which, after extensive investigation, were known only as victims 7, 8, and 9. Police morale was at a low point, and citizen unrest was running high. After consulting with experts, Ness persuaded the city's newspapers to give the crimes minimal publicity. He reasoned that publicity was encouraging the murderer to continue his killing. With the muted publicity following the 3 1937 victims, the police were free to follow legitimate leads rather than waste their time following up thousands of worthless tips. Based upon Dr. Gerber's new analysis, they investigated physicians, medical students, and male nurses, which I've said like 10 times now. Gerber saw evidence of the killer's medical training that his predecessor had not. 1937 was exciting enough without the media-induced hysteria of the Kingsbury Run murders. For most of the year, Ness devoted his efforts to labor racketeers and did not personally spend much time on the serial murder case. While Ness was riding high on the coattails of his victory against the labor racketeers, detectives Peter Merlot and Martin Zalewski, Orly May and Emil Musil, and many others continued their tireless and frustrating search for the Mad Butcher. Many months had passed since the body of the 9th victim had been found, and the trail was clearly cold. Nonetheless, the men continued to interrogate hundreds of suspects. Once they exhausted the leads generated by the 9th victim, the detectives decided to concentrate more closely on the only 2 victims who had been identified, Edward Andrassy and Florence Polillo. Perhaps both of these homicides had not been investigated as thoroughly as they should have been, But then in 1935 and early 1936, nobody had understood that there was a serial killer at work. The detectives retraced all of the leads and suspects from the earlier murders, but ended up with nothing but a few photos of Edward Andrassy and an ocean of sordid stories about the lives of Andrassy and Polillo. In mid-March of 1938, something happened that would have a quiet but lasting impact on the case. In Sandusky, a couple hours' drive west of Cleveland, a dog found the severed leg of a man. Police began an immediate search of the swampy area where the leg was found. Lieutenant David Cowles of the Cleveland Police Department went personally to Sandusky to see if there was any connection between this leg and the Mad Butcher. Cowles, the brilliant self-educated forensic expert, remembered that one of the Cleveland surgeons who closely fit the profile of the Mad Butcher was eliminated as a suspect because he was always at a veterans hospital in Sandusky when the Cleveland murders occurred. On a hunch, Cowles visited the Sandusky Soldiers and Sailors Home and started talking to people there. Cowles discovered that Dr. Frank Sweeney had voluntarily admitted himself several times to the Veterans Hospital to treat his alcoholism. Some of these visits overlapped the times when the Mad Butcher was at work in Cleveland. At first sight, it seemed as though his hospitalizations provided a perfect alibi for Dr. Sweeney. Cowles, however, was a persistent man. He wanted to know how closely patients were watched. The answer was that a surgeon who voluntarily sought help for his drinking problem was not really watched at all. It was, after all, a hospital, not a prison, and security was almost non-existent for patients. Also, at various times, particularly holidays and weekends, the hospital was crowded with visitors. Ambulatory patients like Dr. Sweeney could pretty well come and go as they pleased. It was not unusual for an individual suffering from alcoholism to succumb to his needs, get his hands on some liquor, and disappear for a day or two on a binge. Cowles concluded it was possible for Dr. Sweeney to leave the Veterans Hospital and travel by car or train into Cleveland, commit the murders, and return to the hospital without his short absence being noticed. Cowles also found that the Ohio Penitentiary Honor Farm shared some of the facilities with the Veterans Hospital. Eventually, Cowles found his way to Alex Archaki, a convicted burglar who was serving out the rest of his sentence on the prison honor farm. Archaki had developed a symbiotic relationship with Dr. Sweeney. Archaki, through his various connections, kept Dr. Sweeney supplied with liquor throughout his visits to Sandusky, while Dr. Sweeney reciprocated by writing prescriptions for barbiturates and other sought-after drugs. Archaki had something even more interesting for Cowles. The former burglar was convinced that Sweeney was the Mad Butcher. Archaki had first met Sweeney a couple of years earlier at a bar in downtown Cleveland. Archaki was alone when he was approached by Sweeney, who he described as a well-dressed, good-looking extrovert. Sweeney bought him drinks and asked a lot of personal questions. Where was Archaki from? Did he have any family in the city? Was he married? At the time, Archaki thought the questions were unusual. In retrospect, he wondered if Sweeney was qualifying him as a potential victim. After all, it seemed a deliberate act on the part of the Mad Butcher to make sure that most of his later victims were unidentified, probably men and women from out of town and with no close friends or relatives in the area. Archaki told him that he noticed that Sweeney's unexplained absences from the hospital coincided with the estimated times of death for several victims, and Archaki was positive. Whenever Sweeney was missing for a day or so, a fresh body in Cleveland would turn up shortly after his return to the hospital in Sandusky. In late March, shortly after Cowles' visit to the hospital, the police in Sandusky determined that the severed leg found by the dog was the result of legitimate surgery and not the work of the Mad Butcher. How does a leg show up in a swamp after surgery? Are they just chucking body parts out there? Nevertheless, Cowles was energized by the trip. For the first time, he felt he had a really strong suspect. When he got back to Cleveland, he arranged for a very discreet investigation of Dr. Sweeney. While the doctor came from a very poor family, he was first cousin to Congressman Martin L. Sweeney, a very colorful and controversial political powerhouse in the local Democratic Party. Dr. Francis Edward Sweeney was born in 1894 into an impoverished Irish family who lived on the east side of Cleveland at the edge of Kingsbury Run. Tragedy marked Frank's early life. His father had been badly injured in an accident, and his mother had died of a stroke when he was 9, leaving him and his several siblings to eke out a most frugal existence. Despite the family's poverty, Frank was determined to make a success of himself. His very high intelligence and strong work ethic allowed Frank to work his way through undergraduate work, pharmacy school, and medical school, all while holding down full-time jobs. His classmates in medical school elected him vice president of his sophomore class, and his professors recommended him without reservation. After decades of exhausting effort, he graduated from medical school in St. Louis in 1928 and became a surgical resident at St. Alexis Hospital in the Kingsbury Run area. His siblings remembered him as a man who was almost completely absorbed in science and medicine. Even so, he would stop what he was doing and immediately attend to a family member who was injured or sick. His concern for the health of his siblings and their children endeared him to them. They all respected his intelligence and medical expertise. Sweeney's expertise as a surgical resident allowed him to become a protege of the highly respected teaching physician, Dr. Carl Hamann. Sweeney seemed to have a very promising career ahead of him. He had a dark-haired Slavic beauty for a wife and 2 young sons. Unfortunately for Frank, just at the eve of his hard-earned achievement, destructive pressures were building inside of him. Overwork and a hereditary tendency towards alcoholism and psychosis began taking an obvious toll on his health. He was admitted to City Hospital for alcoholism, but the treatment was unsuccessful. The drinking worsened and his marriage and career began to disintegrate. He was violent and abusive at home, and the hospital severed its relationship with him. Eventually, his wife filed for divorce in 1936, seeking custody of the children and an order restraining him from visiting, interfering, or molesting her. According to his wife, Dr. Sweeney had begun to drink continuously 2 years after their marriage in July of 1927, and remained in a state of habitual drunkenness until their separation in September of 1934. Cowles took particular note of timing of Sweeney's deterioration, which seemed to reach a climax just about the time that the Lady of the Lake, the probable first victim in the murder series, washed up on the shores of Lake Erie, September 5, 1934. Some of Sweeney's problems may have been genetic, others caused by an injury during World War I, and some by overwork. Alcoholism ran in Frank's family and had gripped both Frank and his father. Mental illness was also a factor. His father spent the last years of his life in an asylum, suffering what was loosely termed psychosis. He received a severe head injury in France during World War I and was subsequently awarded a partial disability pension. Other facts made Sweeney a compelling suspect, as far as Cowles was concerned. Dr. Sweeney was born, raised, and spent most of his life in the Kingsbury Run area. He knew the area intimately from his boyhood explorations. Dr. Sweeney was a large and strong man, certainly powerful enough to carry Edward Andrassy and his unidentified companion down the steep, rugged embankment of Jackass Hill. Clearly, Dr. Sweeney had the medical knowledge to perform so many expert decapitations and dismemberments. And finally, Dr. Sweeney's alleged bisexuality could possibly explain why the Mad Butcher chose men and women victims, whereas most sex crimes were directed at one sex or the other. Just as Cowles was completing his investigation of Dr. Sweeney, the news broke that a woman's leg had been fished out of the Cuyahoga River on April 8, 1938. Cowles, Ness, and the entire police department wished that this small fragment of bone and tissue did not represent a new victim. Perhaps it was the result of a boating accident, hospital refuse like in Sandusky, or even the remnants of an earlier victim. Their hopes were dashed when Coroner Gerber announced that the woman's shin was just a few days old. A nasty dispute erupted between Ness and the coroner. Ness was annoyed that Gerber seemed to be building himself a national reputation on the publicity he was generating over these. Ness insisted on an independent evaluation of the time of death. Infuriated, Gerber refused. Gerber answered only to the taxpayers who elected him and not to the Cleveland Police Department, which had failed to find the killer. A month later, Gerber was proven right. 2 burlap bags containing a woman's nude, bisected torso, thighs, and foot were hauled out of the Cuyahoga River. Her head and arms were never found. Gerber estimated the dead woman was between 25 and 30 years old, approximately 5 feet 3 inches tall, and about 120 pounds. Her hair was light brown. Very little could be told about this unknown woman, except that she was flat-chested, had once had a cesarean birth, had sustained a bilateral laceration of the cervix from an additional birth or an abortion, and had her appendix removed. The autopsy showed no presence of hypnotic or narcotic drugs in the tissues. The cause of death was probably from decapitation. Once again, a squad of detectives went into action. Not unexpectedly, this woman, like almost all of the victims, was never identified. Preventing identification was obviously important to the killer. Usually the heads and hands, the most obvious means of identification, were missing from the rest of the bodies. Police theorized that heads and hands were either buried somewhere or had been dumped in Lake Erie and weighed down with rocks. The burlap bags that held the body yielded no worthwhile results. After a while, as in the previous murders, the detectives were all eventually reassigned to other cases, leaving Detective Merlot to continue the search. Unfortunately, in the 1930s, the phenomenon of serial killers was very poorly understood. Not realizing that serial killers usually choose strangers as their victims, the police used a traditional approach to solving homicides. Looking for motives and opportunity among the victim's acquaintances solved many homicides, but rarely worked with serial killers. Neither Ness nor Gerber realized that the organized and highly intelligent serial killer was almost impossible to catch with the forensic knowledge and technology available in those times. Scotland Yard and numerous police experts from around the world had volunteered their views on the crimes, but nothing seemed to be working. Cowles held out a glimmer of hope with his new suspect, Dr. Sweeney. Cowles was by nature a cautious man, and he fully understood that any investigation of a congressman's physician cousin must be exceptionally discreet. Surveillance of Dr. Sweeney required someone smart and trustworthy, who could be counted on to keep his mouth shut about who he was following and why. Thomas Whalen, a promising young rookie cop, was one of the men chosen to follow the doctor wherever he went. The young rookie was no match for the brilliant Dr. Sweeney. One day, the doctor was shopping in a large department store while Whalen watched from a distance. He followed Sweeney down the length of the store until he made an abrupt right turn near the elevators and disappeared from Whalen's sight. When Whalen turned right, Dr. Sweeney was waiting for him. Shocked and embarrassed, Whalen said nothing and started to walk away. But Dr. Sweeney smiled, introduced himself, and asked Whalen his name. Whalen, completely nonplussed, told him his name and continued to follow Sweeney at a suitable distance. It really did not matter whether Sweeney knew he was being followed, as long as he could be kept under surveillance. Unfortunately, Sweeney was able to slip away from Whalen and one of the other policemen assigned to follow him. Whalen came to appreciate Sweeney's perverse sense of humor when he followed the doctor to an all-black bar. Whalen took a seat at the far end of the bar from Sweeney. The crowd, unused to 2 white strangers, stared suspiciously at Whalen and Sweeney, and and all evening long, Sweeney sent down mugs of beer to Whalen at the other end of the bar. While Whalen and his colleagues did their best to keep Dr. Sweeney under surveillance, the police searched every inch of his office and rooms. The police even monitored his mail. Despite the growing public pressure to capture the Mad Butcher, Ness refused to personally engage himself in the case. Instead, he continued with the programs that he had initiated years before, modernizing the police and fire departments, cleaning up crime, and generally making Cleveland a much safer place to live. Just when the public uproar around the April 1938 victim had subsided, a dismembered body was accidentally found at a dump at the end of East 9th Street. Men combing the dump for bits of scrap metal came across the body of a woman wrapped in rags, brown paper, and cardboard. Uncharacteristically, the head and hands were found with the rest of the body. As police were combing the area for more forensic evidence, a bystander found more bones nearby and called over the police. Detective Sergeant James Hogan picked up a large tin can nearby to carry the bones. As he looked down into the large can, a skull gaped back at him from inside. Immediately, the police started to search the area in the remaining daylight. The skeletal remains of a man were scattered around, some of which had been wrapped in brown paper. Gerber estimated that the woman had been a Caucasian between 30 and 40 years old, about 5 feet 4 inches tall, and weighing approximately 120 to 125 pounds. While much of her viscera had decomposed, the skin on her back seemed well preserved. She was dismembered by a large, sharp knife. Gerber guessed that she had died sometime between mid-February and mid-April, possibly before victim 10 in early April. Gerber thought that her remains had only been at the dump for a few weeks. The cause of death was undetermined, but was considered a probable homicide. Police were initially excited when they were able to lift a fingerprint of her left thumb, but the hope faded when they were unable to match it in their files. The skull and bones found a couple of 100 feet away from the woman's remains were those of a white man between 30 and 40 years of age. He was estimated to have been between 5 feet 6 inches and 5 feet 8 inches tall, weighing approximately 135 to 150 pounds. His hair was long, coarse, and dark brown in color. He was also dismembered with a long, sharp knife. Again, the cause of death was undetermined, but considered a probable homicide. If these two individuals were in fact victims 11 and 12 of the Mad Butcher, then he had changed his operating style. Leaving heads and hands was uncharacteristic of the victims found since 1936. Also, the dump was a place that the serial killer had not used before. When Kingsbury Run became overrun with police and railroad detectives, the Mad Butcher used the Cuyahoga River as his next favorite cemetery. Also, these two bodies were really found by accident. The butcher, for the most part, made sure that his victims were found either out in the open in Kingsbury Run or floating in the Cuyahoga River. Ness and Cowles had doubts about whether these two bodies were even homicides, let alone the victims of the Mad Butcher. Regardless of whether the two bodies were the work of the Mad Butcher or not, the people of Cleveland believed they were. The public and political pressure of these unsolved murders erupted in a torrent of criticism of Ness and the police department. The newspapers demanded an end to the ghoulish crimes that had tarnished the city's reputation, just as it was slowly recovering from the Depression. Ness was desperate. He needed to show results quickly and visibly. He conferred with his boss, Mayor Burton, and key members of his police department, and then made a mistake in judgment that would haunt him for almost a decade. The night of August 18, 1938, 2 days after the bodies were found at the dump, Ness led a huge midnight raid on the city's shanty towns, the villages of dilapidated shacks that had grown up since the Depression. Ness and his men started behind Public Square and then moved deeper into the flats area near the Cuyahoga River and finally over to Kingsbury Run. With the sirens screaming, Ness and his men stormed the shanty towns and hobo camps, chasing down and capturing the terrified vagrants. Most were taken down to the police station, fingerprinted, and sent off to the workhouse, while police combed the rubble for any signs of the Mad Butcher. Finally, the police torched the shanties so that the men could not go back to their hovels. A couple of days later, the Cleveland press criticized him sharply for rousting the bums out of their hovels and burning down their shanties. That such shanty towns exist is a sorrowful reflection upon the state of society. The throwing into jail of men broken by experience and the burning of their wretched places of habitation will not solve the economic problem, nor is it likely to lead to the solution of the most macabre mystery in Cleveland's history. The city was in an uproar. The pressure on Elliot Ness to resolve the murders was so intense that he pulled his chief suspect, the alcoholic Dr. Frank Sweeney, into a secret interrogation in a suite at the Cleveland Hotel at Public Square. Lieutenant Cowles made it quite clear to Sweeney that if he did not cooperate with this discreet interrogation, that he would be hauled down to the station with all the reporters in tow. Dr. Sweeney, in deference to his immediate family, chose the route of discreet inquiry. After drying out for 3 days in the luxurious hotel suite, a comparatively sober, amused, and confident Dr. Sweeney was interrogated by 4 men: Elliot Ness, Dr. Royal Grossman, the court psychiatrist, Lieutenant David Cowles, and Dr. Leonard Keeler, one of the inventors of the polygraph, who had come with his equipment from Chicago at Ness's request. Secrecy was critical because Dr. Sweeney's first cousin, the powerful and outspoken Congressman Martin L. Sweeney, could not be tipped off about this interrogation. Also, Ness had to treat this suspect very carefully because at any moment, Dr. Sweeney could call in the congressman and the interrogation would end. On Tuesday morning, August 23rd, Dr. Francis E. Sweeney was dressed smartly in a freshly pressed suit, a crisp white shirt, and a tasteful tie, compliments of the hotel cleaning service. The tall, powerfully built man in his mid-40s seemed rested and calm. The dark frames of his glasses gave a scholarly look to his attractive Irish features. Frank Sweeney looked very much the part of the confident, successful surgeon he might have one day become. He introduced himself cordially to the serious-looking men who had come to interrogate him. While Keeler excused himself to the second bedroom to set up the polygraph equipment, Ness, Grossman, and Cowles sat with Dr. Sweeney in the comfortable parlor. For the next 2 hours, Cowles and Grossman did most of the questioning. Ness listened closely. Sweeney was clearly playing with them, cracking jokes and answering their questions vaguely. Ness could see that they were getting nowhere and went into the bedroom to check on Keeler. Keeler was ready for Sweeney, so the doctor was escorted into the bedroom where he was fitted with the polygraph sensors. Only Ness stayed with Dr. Keeler as the polygraph was administered. Cowles had prepared Keeler with a list of questions to which Keeler added his own. Ness had already been briefed on the workings of the polygraph and knew what to look for as the test was being given. Keeler's questions began innocuously. Was his name Dr. Francis Edward Sweeney? Was he born in Ohio? Did he have 2 sons, Francis and James? The machine registered the truthfulness of Sweeney's answers. The questions quickly became more specific. Had he ever met Edward Andrassy? Did he kill Edward Andrassy? Had he ever met Florence Polillo? Did he kill Florence Polillo? Ness watched closely as the polygraph recorded its response to Sweeney's denials. When he was finished, Dr. Keeler thanked Sweeney and asked him to stay where he was for a few minutes. Keeler and Ness left the room, closing the door behind them, and went into the parlor where Grossman and Cowles were waiting. Keeler told them it looked like Sweeney was their guy. Grossman, the psychiatrist, said, "I believe we have a classic psychopath here with the likelihood of some schizophrenia. His father spent the last 3 years of his life locked up, a violent schizoid personality aggravated by chronic alcoholism." Ness had difficulty reconciling the smooth-talking, highly intelligent surgeon with the homicidal maniac that he had come to know as the Mad Butcher. "It seems incredible to me that someone with his brains and education could be the monster we're looking for." That afternoon, Dr. Keeler retested Sweeney several times, always with the same result. The men were left with the conclusion that Sweeney was the killer, but they only had circumstantial evidence. Ness was certain that he could never get a conviction with what they had on Sweeney, especially with his high-profile cousin involved. Ness realized that he could always choose to have the doctor followed constantly, but the physician had already shown that he could evade the surveillance. What exactly happened next is a mystery. The only thing that is clear is that Dr. Sweeney admitted himself to the Sandusky Veterans Hospital 2 days after the interrogation. From August 25, 1938 until his death in 1965, Sweeney went from one hospital to another, both state mental hospitals and the veterans' hospitals in various parts of the country. He was not a prisoner and could leave the hospital voluntarily for days and months at a time. However, at least in the Sandusky Hospital, there was a note attached to his records insisting that if the doctor ever left the hospital grounds, that the hospital was to immediately notify the police in Sandusky and Cleveland. In October of 1955, Dr. Sweeney was committed to the Dayton Veterans Hospital for the remaining decade of his life. Still, he was free to wander around the neighborhood, writing prescriptions for himself and his friends, until the hospital campaigned with the local pharmacist to cut off his drug supply. What is unknown is why Dr. Sweeney admitted himself to the hospital and why he voluntarily stayed institutionalized for most of the rest of his life. As Frank Sweeney's alcoholism worsened, his sense of humor became more bizarre. One of his family members speculated that he hid his natural melancholy with his humor. When he was at the Veterans Hospital in Dayton, Ohio, he sent a series of strange and incomprehensible jeering postcards to Elliot Ness. Despite Frank's bizarre postcards, his siblings never believed that Frank was capable of violence. They saw him as a tragic figure who had everything within his grasp and then lost it all. A brilliant man destroyed by alcoholism and his own demons. The serial killings officially stopped in 1938. The last victim, the so-called Victim 10, was killed April of 1938, even though remains of so-called victims 11 and 12 were found in mid-August of that year. Even though the murders officially ended in 1938, the hunt for the killer continued. Detective Peter Merlot made a career out of hunting the killer and was eager to tie similar murders to the same person. Private investigator Pat Lyons was hired to investigate the Kingsbury Run murders. After many months, Lyons focused on a middle-aged alcoholic named Frank Dolezal. Supposedly, Lyons had found a tavern that had been frequented by Andrassy and Polillo. Dolezal was another patron of this particular saloon. The sheriff had his men search a room, which Dolezal had previously rented, and they found stains on the floor and a knife. Lyons had his chemist brother analyze the stains, and the results came back that they were human blood. Meanwhile, Cleveland detective Peter Merlot got wind of this investigation of Dolezal, a suspect that Merlot had already investigated and rejected. O'Donnell wanted to move fast before the Cleveland police could interfere with his suspect, so he had Dolezal arrested July 5, 1939. After a rough night with the sheriff's jailer, Michael Kilbane, Dolezal confessed to the murder of Flo Polillo. Kilbane had a reputation for cruelty, so gentleman Harry Brown, not Kilbane, officially took the confession. Claiming that he and Flo had a fight, Dolezal said she went at him with a butcher knife. To defend himself, he hit her and she fell against a bathtub. Assuming that she was dead, he cut her up and carried part of her to the alley in which she was found. Her head and other parts of her body he supposedly dumped into Lake Erie. There was other evidence against Dolezal. Lyons had heard that a young woman, who was also an alcoholic, had a suspicious encounter with Dolezal. Lyons took a bottle of cheap whiskey when he went to interview the woman. There was still some whiskey left when she claimed that Dolezal had come at her with a knife, and she jumped out of a second-story window to escape him. Miraculously, she had only broken the heel of her shoe in this daring escape. While Dolezal was probably not a great person, he is not widely accepted as the killer. Dr. Sweeney is the person most believed to have carried out the killings. Once he went into the hospital, the killing stopped. Unfortunately, this is one that's going to remain unsolved. And yes, there are some ghost stories associated with the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run that I will be sharing over on the Patreon account. You can support the show by becoming a loyal lurker at Patreon for just $5 per month, where you can receive additional content. The link is in the show notes. And until next time, keep lurking.